Hello everyone and welcome back to my podcast series Invested, where I sit down with founders, creators, and operators making an impact in the business world. Today I have the pleasure of chatting with Colin Rocker, who you may know as Career Colin on TikTok and Instagram. With more than 375,000 followers across all platforms, Colin creates content for students and young professionals to level up in their careers. After working as a management consultant as well as spending some time in startups and advertising, he began sharing some of the lessons he learned in regards to navigating his own career on social media, especially for whom he called first-gen professionals. He has landed brand partnerships with Glassdoor, L'Oreal, Microsoft, and Google, and he has frequently led talks and workshops with a number of professional organizations and universities on career success. I met Colin at an event here in New York City, and I was blown away by his authenticity and kindness and knew I had to have him on the podcast. In this conversation, we chat about breaking into NYC consulting from a non-target school, setting boundaries and thinking about mental health as a young professional, defining what makes someone truly wealthy, and so much more. If you're a student or a young professional looking for insights on how to create a life that you can be proud of and excited to wake up every day, then this podcast is for you. And with that, my conversation with Colin Rocker. That's what the pros do.
Love it.
All right, Colin, thank you so much for joining us here today. You have had an amazing career. You've done a lot. Can you just give us the 60-second breakdown of what you've done so far in your career to get you to where you are today?
Absolutely. Yeah, I always tell people I've had one of these Infinity Gauntlet careers because I feel like I've gone around a couple different industries kind of collecting my stones and my skills along the way. So out of college, I got my start in management consulting here in New York. I started at Deloitte, did that for a couple of years. Great experience, happy to go into that more. But like most consultants, I had that experience of I really wanted to put my hands on something and do work that I felt was more tangible. And so after that, I switched into the startup land, and so I joined a seed stage, venture-backed startup, very scrappy, very small. I went from a 400,000 person organization to a 14 person organization, and so I had that whole experience. And then we ran out of money, and I said, okay, I got to go find something else. And then my last sort of corporate journey was in advertising actually. So I was an account manager, modern day Mad Men stuff, making amazing campaigns, doing photo shoots for big, huge brands. It was really, really fun. And then my latest role has been full-time creator, career advocate, speaker, coach, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Mad Men. I was listening to one of your other podcasts. You said that Mad Men, Suits, those shows were a big inspiration for you. Also, not just to understand what's going on in the business world, but to give you just an understanding of the culture and what life was like in New York, because I know you grew up in Georgia, not necessarily in the most corporate environment. So we'd love to kind of just learn, how that influenced you and, maybe how it made you decide to go into consulting of all the things that you probably could have done.
That's a great question. My to take this back, my dad was a plumber, and so he did residential and commercial plumbing. And so in Atlanta, when he was on his big commercial jobs, we'd be driving through the city, through Midtown, and you've got these huge 10 to 20 story buildings, and it's they're made out of glass. You see people coming out wearing suits and holding coffees. And when I was young, I always wondered what do people do in these buildings, right? Because we're in the basement, knee deep, and trying to get the system moving again. And so those shows were really impactful for me because it gave me a very obviously dramatized view of what went on in these environments, and I saw people speaking very clearly, persuading people, dressing nice, having really cool experiences with travel, making a lot of good money. And so I was like, okay, this is something that I think I want to take a swing at, and so I sort of set myself up late high school and all throughout college to be able to do that as my full-time job. So that was kind of the impetus behind why corporate, why New York, and all these other things.
Sure. Well, transitioning into content, I know you've been doing that now for the last how long has it been? At least
3 years.
3 years. Yeah, fantastic. So what you were obviously a few years into your career, crushing it, doing a lot of different things, making progress professionally. What motivated you to start creating content?
It's a good question. I mean, honestly, it was really pandemic era, lockdown boredom. What really started that was in 2020, we were all having experiences of, I think, we had a lot of things missing in our lives. And I was put in a situation where, I felt like I needed a creative outlet. And so I really saw, actually hated TikTok at first, but the first night I downloaded it, I was up until 2 a.m. and I was like, okay, there's something here, right? It's very entertaining, it's engaging. And so I started posting workout content and motivational content, business news content that no one cared about.
Sure.
And then I posted one video that was that day in the life type of vlog-ish nature, just about what my life was like working in consulting at that point, and it blew up, and I got all these questions, and people wanted to know, how do I get started? How do you do this? How do you get promoted? And so I really just started, turning out content in that way. And then in the last sort of year, I really got clear on what my mission was and who my ideal audience and community member was. And so I define myself now as someone making career and corporate content for other people who are first-gen professionals like me, whose parents are, weren't as accustomed to that like corporate environment, and they really had to learn a lot of things on their own.
Yeah. At that time, there were a lot of creators who started creating content. Then even Andrew Young, I don't know if you know Andrew Young, but he started creating events.
Yeah.
It post 2020, just seeing that there was much more of a need of in-person collaboration, and so I think a lot of amazing things have stemmed from that time when people were socially isolated, maybe devoid of creativity and wanted something. So fantastic that it kind of snowballed into what it is. And it was a similar experience for me actually when I started creating content on YouTube. One of my first videos was talking about University of Florida and how I got into the school. And so I made a video about that in my dorm room and naturally got a lot of questions asking about campus life, academics, social life, all of that. And that's kind of what created the other videos that I was making. So it's kind of a similar story where you had one start and then it kind of just was a flywheel of other content ideas.
Yeah, life has been interesting. When I was 18, my lifelong goal was definitely not to be a social media influencer, but I think it's been really interesting to see this space explode because you're right. I think a lot of people in 2020, 2021, when we were going through that, sort of said, what can I do? How can I take either my professional knowledge or just like my interest or my passion and start to just share that with a wider audience?
Yeah.
And then we're seeing that, really be rewarded in the marketplace. So it's definitely it's an interesting industry thing that I'm still trying to navigate. I mean, I essentially like work somewhat in marketing now when you think about that from a brand deal perspective, and like that's completely new to me, right? Like I live in PowerPoints and spreadsheets, and so like it's been really cool but really challenging in a good way to sort of flip that switch and try to think honestly in a more creative way, which has been really cool.
Yeah, well, a follow-on question from that, you worked in management consulting, so of course there's a lot of stereotypes and memes about that, the true business value that one creates, which I can say as a former consultant myself. But now that you've been an entrepreneur, you're on your own now doing this full-time. Like you said, you have to wear a lot of different hats: the marketing, the creative, the just the legal, basically, with the negotiating contracts, all of that. So I'm curious, like, how much do you think you've learned just through this experience? Like, would you say that you've learned more about the overall business world through this kind of solopreneur experience, or during your few years as a management consultant?
That's a good flip on that question. I mean, I think, again, I do think there is some validity to the point of like working like a traditional big consulting job gives you an idea of how executives in very large public organizations work, that I feel like I'm not getting that exposure as like an individual creator, but just the raw fundamentals of like money comes in, money goes out, and like how to actually run a business. I'm definitely getting a crash course in a school of hard knocks education on that. But I think one thing I've done that's been really smart this year is I've started to build a team. And so right now I've got a manager, I've got an agent that's working with me on some very specific projects, I have an accountant, I've got a lawyer, I've got a financial advisor, and I brought on all these people to help me sort of track what's coming in and bring in more of that. And then also when I come in, like, am I, spending, investing, and like living in a way that allows me to do this for a long time, right? And so I think like going legit in a way is like, I used to run this off Venmo, brands would send me PayPals, it's like, it was very raw in the beginning because I didn't even know you could do this and get paid for it, right? But as it's become more of a true like vocation and like a career, definitely like the way I've learned is that I don't know everything and I'm not good at everything, and so I've brought on people who've really helped me accelerate the business. That's what allows you to focus on what you're good at. That's right. Not saying that you're not a great accountant, you're not at all, but not that you couldn't probably figure it out in QuickBooks. You're much better actually being the talent creating the videos. So absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense and there's merit there. Going back to kind of just the corporate experience, you're a proud graduate of the University of Georgia. Yes. As a fellow SEC graduate, I'll just say good job. Good. Yes. But with that said, Georgia's a great school, but there's not a traditional pipeline necessarily from Georgia to New York City management consulting. Sure, there's plenty of graduates, but it's not one of those target schools that has hundreds of students go into it each year. So I'm just curious, from your experience, what do you think kind of allowed you to find success in that process, and what would you advise to another student at a large state school who wants to maybe go down a similar path and is struggling to kind of gain some traction there? Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that what really helped me is I performed exceptionally well in my interviews, because I will say that you're right, like getting into a Big Four consulting firm in their New York, global headquarters is certainly not something that's commonly done at a school like the University of Georgia. But if I wanted to do like a Nashville or an Atlanta or a Charlotte, that was very much within my grasp. But I knew I wanted New York, right? And so from the outset, it was something I said in all of my interviews, which some gumption there, but like it takes that, and you have to remind them of that. But I also knew that I was prepared. I mean, I had done 50 to 75 different case interviews to practice for that moment, right? Like I was networking my butt off both within the firm and at other firms. I was going to every single event I could, and I was making sure that like people knew my name.
Yep.
And I was really, really good in the recruitment process, and everyone knew me. But I was also very upfront to the fact of like, I told them in my last interview I wouldn't even accept the offer unless it was New York, right?
Yep.
But I felt like I had that backing because I had performed so well up until that point. And so I think it's like, if you know you want to go to one of these like tier 1 cities, like an LA, a Chicago, a New York, whatever, San Francisco, you have to really, really perform, and you have to make it well known, and then just hope for the best, right? Like I was lucky that UGA is at least a school that the Big Four comes to,
right?
But like it was my senior year before like the BCGs and the McKinseys even knew we existed. Like that wasn't even an option for me, but now it is for people at that university. So go to the best college you can and just be as upfront as possible, and make sure you really, really know your stuff when it comes to that interview.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good advice, and so much of the time people think about just the technicals that you need to have and all of that, but it's like that only matters if you can actually get to that stage in the interview process. And so, it's just impressive what you were able to do. And it was a similar experience for me coming from the University of Florida.
Yes.
A lot of people in Miami, Tampa, Atlanta, Charlotte, but not many in New York. So fantastic that you were able to do that. I know you also were in a business fraternity in school. What was that experience like?
You've done your homework.
I have. Well, I wasn't in a business fraternity at UF, but I know a lot of people who were and had a great experience. And I think there is a lot of power in being in a community like that with other like-minded individuals who want to get a certain level of course, the corporate experience. And at UF, we had a certain master's program that I, again, wasn't in, but it was what you would do if you wanted to go into investment banking, just because you have that community, the people a year older than you, 2 years older, had successfully navigated the application process. They could provide advice, be mentors. So I was just curious kind of what your experience was like in that, and if you would suggest, for someone who maybe is a freshman on campus now, if they should think about joining a business fraternity.
Not only suggest, I would say if you want to go, especially into the fields that we've had the privilege of working in, I would say it's almost a requirement, especially if you're at one of these excellent SEC, very reputable and amazing public colleges. Like, it's almost required, I would say. And I would say, like, my closest friends to this day, I all met through that experience of going to that fraternity, which I was in, Delta Sigma Pi or DSP. That's, there are two big ones, and there are a couple other smaller ones that, like, focus on specific industries. But, like, I met my wife through my business fraternity.
Wow.
Like, I literally, I joke about that, but, like, I met my wife at, like, a networking event, and we hit it off. And so, like, that's literally how this stuff happens. I think in life, you have to constantly think about what unfair advantages you can create for yourself. And joining a business fraternity was one of those advantages, because you have, they've literally got question banks of, like, when this firm comes to school, these are the questions they ask. They have existing relationships with the on-campus recruiters. And so there's the university-wide recruitment event that firm will do, and then they'll spend the whole week there, and so then they'll go to individual organizations that they have relationships with. And so I always tell people, you want to be in as small of a room as possible. Go to the 500-person event, but then you want to make sure you're in the 50-person room too, and you're there early, and you stay late, and you have really good questions, right? I would say it was fundamentally the biggest thing, other than just going to UGA in and of itself, like, that I did that set me up for success.
I think that's really great advice. Finding your competitive advantage is something I always say too, and I think for for people who may not have the privilege of having connections to an industry or a company because of their family, which plenty of people don't, that's a way to kind of not fabricate, but you create you create those connections that maybe you wouldn't have had if you weren't in the organization. So I think it's a great pipeline and a great opportunity for a lot of students. Talking about the content again, one of your videos you mentioned that you think it's important for students or anyone to have two different elevator pitches.
That's right.
Can you explain what those two different elevator pitches are and when you may use one compared to the other?
Yeah, totally. So that whole concept is, honestly, it's related to the first and professional thing, because you're going to be in environments that are incredibly professional, but also incredibly personal, where you're going to have to introduce yourself and talk about the work you do, right? And so I think the mistake I see people make, which ruins the chances and the odds of you really forming a connection with that person, is if you come in with all this really specific lingo and terminology that's specific to your industry. That can help if you're in a very professional environment where you need to demonstrate that you know what you're talking about, right, and that you're not too green. But if you're at the family barbecue, or you're at a wedding, or someone asks you what you do, you listing off, like, a very specific title of what you do and, like, the very nuanced particulars of your job, that's not helping you, right? And so I think there's an old copywriting adage of, like, clear beats clever every day of the week. And so it's like, how clearly can you get across what you do? And then based upon the reaction that you get, or the type of questions or follow-up statements you get, then you can either go deeper or pull back further based on the level of context you've established with that person. Because you want to demonstrate that you have a job, right? And then you can connect with, or just, like, have a conversation with someone regardless of how much they know about the work you do. So I think you need a high context pitch and a low context pitch.
I think that's super smart, especially now, I guess this is kind of a follow-on question, but before when you were doing this full time, this is something I still experience where it's like, okay, am I here because I'm a creator? Am I here because it's finance? Like, what identity am I showing up as? And so it is kind of like you're flip-flopping sometimes, you're switching contexts. But
I'll hang out there a bit because I think this is something that more and more people in this day and age are running into. Because a lot of people, even if it isn't content, a lot of people, everyone has multitudes, but a lot of people are doing that in a way where it's becoming a side business or a side hustle or a side vocation. And so I think that's a really good point, because I struggled with that too when I was still working a full-time job. How did I get to this event? Like, who am I in the context of this room? And that's something that I think everyone should be just reminding themselves of, or asking themselves based on the situation they find themselves in.
Yeah. All right, so we all know that one of the wonders of the world is compound interest. One of the things that you've also talked about in your videos is the power of compound networking.
Yes.
As we met at a networking event, we're both strong advocates of networking and putting yourself out there, but can you explain to the viewers what compound networking is, and maybe some examples of how you've seen it kind of come to fruition in your own life?
100%. So I think in my content, one thing that I talk about a lot that gets me a lot of attention is networking, what I call subtle social skills in the workplace, because I think that's something, because of the environment of 2020 and how a lot of people entered into the professional world, it's been something that younger professionals have really lost, or they don't see the importance in. And so based on that, a lot of people that reach out to me for advice on networking specifically, they approach it in a way that's very transactional, in the sense of how do I talk to this one individual that may have a job for me? How do I talk to this one person and have one conversation to get to this outcome that I want, right? And I challenge that, because that's just that's not how the world works at all, and that's not really building a relationship, right? I didn't have an engagement ring the first time I met my wife, right? Like, you gotta build. She probably wishes I did, but you gotta you gotta build that relationship, right? At first. And so I think the idea of compound networking is like compound interest. You're just making deposits over time, and you're not approaching the conversation in a way that's transactional. And you're just periodically reaching out. Like, I think through LinkedIn and a couple other apps now, they're very organic ways of just popping up in people's lives based around occasions. And so if this person just bought a house, or they just got a new job, or they just started a new business, right? Like, choosing those moments to reach out and just say, hey, congrats on this milestone, thinking about you, hope you're well, let's catch up sometime, with no expectation of something, I think can be really, really successful. And I've definitely seen that in my own life, to the extent where when I was making the transition from startup life to my last job in advertising, that was purely through a connection where actually I got reached out to from someone who I hadn't worked with in 3 years, that had been following me on LinkedIn, had seen some of my content. And I was like, hey, look, I know you've got the consulting experience, you're brilliant with clients, I think you'd be great in this client service role in advertising, which is an industry I'd never worked in, right? And so that was really, really cool. And even now as a creator, like you say, I'm treating it like a job. And so I'm going to events, meeting incredible people like you, reaching out. And at the end of our conversation, I didn't say, so when can I get on the channel? When should I get on the podcast, right? But it was something that very organically happened over time, right? And another example that is just crazy is that next week I'll have the opportunity to speak, not at the UN, but the UN has a speaker series called Innovation Day, right?
I saw that.
I'm going to be one of their speakers, and typically, they bring on people who are PhDs, or they've written 3 books, and they've got 18 TED Talks, right? And I got that opportunity solely based off of networking. And the person that ended up recommending me to do this opportunity was 4 degrees removed from the original person I met at a networking event I was at 5 months ago. And I just kept following up, kept saying, would love to do this, interested in this, I see you're doing that, and just it's just getting out of the transactional part of networking and saying this is a relationship. It's a lane. It's not like a grab thing. You know what I mean? Just build the lane, and then the lane can take you wherever you want to go. Yeah,
that's fascinating. When I actually went to a similar story for myself, is I was posting on LinkedIn. I had some sort of an engagement, and then I got invited to the LinkedIn headquarters for some events. Had a great time there. Was sitting next to someone who was just asking about what I do, and I said I was a creator, and she's like, no way, I teach a creative marketing class at Columbia, and I actually just had a speaker from my class on Monday drop out last minute, and this was Thursday, and she said, would you be interested in coming to speak to my class about your content strategy? And I'm like, sure, you'll have me. And so it was amazing just how that came to be, and
incredible.
Created some good content about going to speak at Columbia and all of that. And so it's just one of those things, I think, once you see the rewards reap in one situation, it's just you totally buy into it. But I think sometimes people just need to see that one seed grow for them to remember how important and impactful it can be. Because if you're doing all of this and you don't ever see it, it could be tough. But it's one of those things, sometimes it really does just take time, and eventually it all starts to compound massively.
The way I'm thinking about this now, and that's a great example, and that's awesome. I need to go find that and react to that. That's really, really cool. Is I think people think about networking as as an action instead of like an activity, right?
Yeah.
It's like no one says it's like someone's approach to like fitness, right? Like you're not going to get buff the first time you go to the gym, but it's like if you build the consistency of like showing up to events, connecting with interesting people, sending emails, texts, follow-ups when it makes sense, like over time you'll, like you say, you will see those results if you just keep up the activity. Yeah, that's a really cool example.
Well,
that's
even
awesome.
related to the gym, I really do feel that going to networking events and being in those social settings where you're not uncomfortable, but you're out of your comfort zone, like that is a muscle that you need to work.
You don't know who you're going to meet, that's for sure.
Exactly. And so it was fascinating this last tech week. A few months ago, I had a lot of my friends come just because they had seen how much fun it had been and how much I had learned in prior years. And I could tell, like, it was their first time ever being in an environment like that. And just the difference, like, you know, it's one of those things, you go to plenty of events by yourself and you don't necessarily see the incremental like improvements in how you approach it, but then when you go to a setting like that and you're with people who are there for the first time and they like make comments like, wow, like, you know, you look so comfortable and all of that, it's like it is a really helpful reminder of like how far you've come, because it's like the gym, you don't see the difference day to day.
I love that
example. So yeah, it was
it's truly a muscle.
So transitioning back to your corporate life, although you did say you're treating the content like a job, as it truly is.
Yeah.
But back when you were in consulting, I know you suffered from a stress-induced migraine that resulted in you going to the hospital.
That's right.
That's a pretty big wake-up call, you know, maybe about what you're doing isn't totally sustainable, or at least for the time that you were doing it. So how did that change kind of your perspective on work and balance and boundaries and all of that? I'm sure that was a pretty major experience.
Yeah, definitely wake up call. First, I'll correct you and say I haven't had a stress-induced work migraine. I've had two.
Okay.
Both were terrible and debilitating, and really like caused me to make some hard reflections on like how I was approaching my work. I think the biggest thing that came out of the last one I had was that I felt like I was taking on too much of what I'll call the wrong type of stress at work. Because I feel like at work you have employee stress, and then you have what I'll call like executive or like CEO stress. And I feel like in my jobs in the past, and every boss, you know, listening to this is going to be cheering when I say this, but like I feel like I've taken almost too much ownership in terms of like if the business or if my specific department isn't doing what I think it should be in order to like, you know, be successful or grow, especially in a startup environment where the last one was, I was going to bed and I was waking up with a lot of that stress, right? And it was manifesting, I mean, physically, like my skin was terrible. When I get really stressed, I actually get like alopecia and my hair starts to fall out. Yeah, like, you know, and it was terrible. But I think I realized like you really got to put the right amount of ownership and the right amount of parts of your work, because obviously you are a piece of a greater whole, you know, and you've got to take incredible pride in like the work you do every day. But at the end of the day, you know, the macroeconomic environment, other people on the team, the freaking weather sometimes, like there's so many things out of your control that could be causing, you know, the place you happen to be working in to not have as much success as you would like it to have, you know. And so I think like the one thing I learned of that is like you really got to be, I really needed to be more mindful of like the stress and the ownership I was taking on, because I felt like that was causing me to have too much of an adverse reaction to things that were completely out of my control at work. And so that was like the big lesson. But another great example of like having, you know, a really good partner in your life, because I would say for both of those, I was, you know, dating and then later like married to my my wife Kaylee, and like it's really good to have people like that in your life that can sort of look at you and have sobering and honest conversations. Like you got to take a step back and you need to like invest in like other parts of your life, because it was literally killing me. So yeah, I think that was the lesson or takeaway, is like, you know, which is funny now because as a, you know, self-employed person, it is all my stress, but you know, I can, but my foot is on the gas pedal, right? And so I can press down really, really hard on Tuesday and then completely take it off on Wednesday, you know? So it's nice.
Well, I mean, you said it yourself, but it's worrying about things that you have control over.
That's right.
In one of your videos, it seemed like you mentioned this, even the stock price is something that you were looking at, that you felt that your actions dictated, which is, we all know is, you know, probably not the truth.
100%.
But, you know, how has that been now where the success of your business is 100% under your control? Like, how have you been able to kind of navigate that, where you mentioned, you know, you can be gung-ho on Tuesday and then maybe be a little bit more relaxed on Friday, but, you know, how do you ever kind of feel settled, not to stress you out now, but how do you ever like take the, I know you enjoy the vacations and all of that, but like, how do you ever get to that stage where it's like, I could be working, I could be creating content, like how do you find that balance?
No, it's tough, because on one hand I feel incredibly like blessed to like work whenever I feel like I want to, but also there are very real things I need to be doing in order to grow, you know, my business and my brand on social media. And so I think like number one is like I am in a really big like transitional stage in my life. Like I recently had like a kid, like I'm starting this like self-employment journey, and so like I'm still figuring out what my schedule looks like, because it's been really, really like hectic, and like in a moment's notice I could have to, you know, take a kid to the pediatrician because he hit his hand or something. And so like I don't know, it's been I won't lie to you. It's been cooking me a little bit. It's been definitely an adjustment of sorts. But yeah, I think it goes back to like communication and support from like the people that you have in your life that you have a responsibility to in terms of like my wife and my baby. And then it's like, at some extent, like, yeah, it is all on me. And so like, I do have to say like, even if I'm not working, as much, like I definitely work like every single day of the week, and like the activities are changing, like I'm having to learn a lot of new different skills. And so it's like, you've got to, own what you can, but like realize that it is like a balance, and I will say that I have like, it is vastly harder to build a business when you've got, dependents and other things in your life than just, these people you see on social media and other parts of the internet that are just, flexing their, their Lambos and their rented private jets. It's easy when you're, 24 and you got a little e-commerce business, But yeah, it's definitely, given me a new level of appreciation for people that are trying to build families as well as building really big businesses.
Yeah. Well, I think you've always done a good job of being authentic in your content. You bring, I was looking through your vlogs today and this last week, and it is nice. And because you don't have the Lambo, you're not giving off a vibe where it totally feels unattainable.
I've got a city bike.
Yeah, the city bike subscription, as do I. So that's the Lambo of New York.
Yeah.
But again, just I'm curious, just the juxtaposition between what you're doing now in your corporate life. What are some pros and cons of working now totally for yourself? Is there any part of working corporate that maybe you miss? You probably don't miss having to travel like you were doing in consulting, but now that it's been a few months, are there any things, even just this, I know being a solopreneur and a creator can sometimes feel isolating, and that is the importance of going to events and having the community, but sometimes it does feel like you're doing a lot by yourself. And so just curious what your perspective is on what maybe you miss or maybe what you don't miss, all of that.
No. There are definitely things I miss, and it's a really good question because it's something I definitely didn't do as much reflection on before I made the decision to go full time.
Yeah.
But I think one of the biggest things I didn't expect to miss is like coworkers and like community. Especially in this thing. It's not just that I've started this business. I've started a business doing something where like not a lot of people can relate to the good and bad of being like an online content creator, influencer type person. So it's a big reason why I go to events like the one I met you at. Like I would consider you a coworker. I consider other people that are making career and like corporate based content, coworkers. And so I've had to be really intentional about going out into the world and like forming relationships with people, because there is no office where every content creator in New York City goes in and we have pizza parties, like that doesn't exist, right? So I've got to create that for myself. I love the flexibility, and I don't feel guilty ever for working in the way I do now, the way I used to, I guess, at my job. Like if I had to work until 11 p.m., that may cause, some stress in my household because of my other responsibilities. But now I know if I spend one night really, really going hard, the next day I can open up time in my schedule to do other things I need to do. So that flexibility is really nice. And then like I would say just the 360 management of like the financials and the self marketing piece and like the building a network and like really seeing what else I can do, because I don't really like I don't want to be an influencer when I'm 87, and so it's like, what does this look like long term, right? I don't think anyone has that answer, but I'm trying to figure that out for myself. That is stressful, but it's also really, really cool, know. So community I would say is the biggest one that I'm working to build, myself, and then love the flexibility and just the big blue ocean that I get to go and chase every day.
So piggybacking off of what you were talking about with the stress from work and feeling that you had a lot of weight on your shoulders, how do you suggest creating a boundary for yourself as a young professional? Because I know a lot of people speak about, your early years when you have to just be totally grinding, be the first one in the office, the last one out, always being available. But then there's a now shift where it's, prioritize your mental health, and your job isn't your life. And I think to a lot of people starting their careers right now, there's two different voices in their head saying very different things. Yes. So, now being a few years into your career, what would you say, it would be some advice for someone trying to find that balance, but not wanting to hinder the growth that they could have in their career?
Yeah, really good question, and something I think almost no one really talks about because they're so busy, like you say, being on either side of those two camps, right? Those very dichotomous, parts of this. I think, first of all, when you get a job and when you start your work in whatever industry that happens to be, you have to look at people who have been doing it for 10, 20 plus years and say, is this the life I want to live? Could be yes, could be no. But I think it's important that you need to realize what the reward is for all of your effort. Because I think it's easy advice to just tell someone to you just got to grind, you got to lock in. But it's like, if the reward for that locking in 8 to 12 years in the future isn't actually the life you want to live, I think you have to do a reflection of what do you actually want your life to look like before you start that grind. Because I do think that I think it's good advice the first 6 to 9 months of that career. I don't think you should have much balance, because you need to be trying to cover surface area and just prove that you have the mettle to do whatever it is you've chosen to do, right? But eventually, I would say that like you need to like do some success modeling, and so maybe look at people who are just a couple years ahead of you and saying, you know, if they are showing signs of success, like what are the things that they're doing, and then you have to understand the concept of leverage in your work as well. And so when I started out, I wanted to just do as much as possible for as long as possible, just to show people how, you know, of a hard worker I was. But I think, you know, that's a pretty stupid way to go about it, and no one told me that. But eventually you have to realize that, like, what are the 2 to 4 things that my company actually cares about, that my manager actually cares about, and how can I make sure that I'm pursuing those opportunities and doing really, really good at those things. And then maybe you have one thing that you do just because you actually like to do it. But like, yeah, I think like leverage is a really big one, because you have to make sure you're doing the things that are actually going to move you up the ladder, while understanding that, and again, there's something no one else told me, but like a lot of times variety is the trade-off for trajectory. So like in consulting, I saw people that, you know, were doing trips to, you know, they were doing implementations in like Amsterdam, and they got to go to London and rent like sports cars, like they were doing all these really cool works, and they were traveling all the time. Then there were other people who were, I'm going to do SAP implementation in Chicago, you know, and that's all they did. And they went further and got like connections deeper, because that's what either of those people wanted, right? So you have to know what you're in for. But then once you know what you're in for, I mean, yeah, I would say like you have to pursue it while recognizing that like you know what you can and can't give up, and know that you can set boundaries. That's something that no one really told me. Like I thought like, you know, sign me up, boss, and like you just got to do what they're asking you to do. But you have a say. You don't have to work every single weekend. You don't have to work till midnight every single night. But like I was doing those things when I first started my career because I thought that's just what was necessary, when it really isn't, you know. Especially I think as you get more senior, especially as you get into more management roles, where it's like it's your decision making and what effort you can create inside of other people that is how you're going to be judged, right? Like when you're 6 to 8 years in your career, maybe you've got that first taste of like what management actually is. Like it's not grinding. You may do a lot of hand wringing over the decisions you're making, but it's like you've got to be able to make the best decisions and lead your team in the way that's going to get you the best results, which doesn't take 60 hours a week, but it takes knowing and having enough leverage in the specific parts and how to move certain people around. And so that's a completely different skill set that I think people don't set themselves up for success for, because they're so focused on like, you know, I bleed like grinding that they get blindsided when it's like, okay, like make a decision. And like, what? You know, they're used to just hammering, you know? So, But
that's something we were talking about Ali Abdallah before we started recording, but he's mentioned it a lot of times because he focuses, of course, on productivity. And I think some people think of just being busy is the equivalent to productivity. That's right. But just doing a bunch of things just for the sake of doing them. And like that doesn't always mean it's the most productive. And like you said, just using your time correctly is super important. And I really like what you said about I think you said like success framing, but thinking through what your managers' lives look like, what their job responsibilities are. And that was a big thing for me when I was at KPMG still doing consulting, is I looked at what the partner on my engagement was doing. And in consulting, as you know, the partner is what everybody junior is aspiring to get to. That's what they all are looking to do. And for myself, I kind of zoomed out and I looked at what his job was and his responsibilities, and I realized that's not what I wanted my life to look like 20 years down the road, 15 years down the road. You know, not just in terms of maybe the work that I was doing, but just the responsibilities and all of that. And that was kind of a big wake-up call. Because it's realizing, okay, even if I check all the boxes and I achieve all of the success that one could aspire to have, it's still not where I want to get to. That's a kind of a big wake-up call. And it's quickly after that I transitioned roles to where I am now. And it's just, I think that's a really important thing that not enough people think about when they're starting their careers. Is like, okay, sure, everybody knows like consulting, investment banking is like a great place to start your career, but then look at the people 20 years in. Are they happy? Do they have like, sure, maybe they might have some money, but are they fulfilled? Do they have a good family life? There are balances there that are,
and there are people that have that level of seniority and a high level of happiness. They've chosen to do certain things, right? I mean, you can have, maybe they do have that apartment in Manhattan, but it's a studio, you know, it's like a one bedroom. There's no partner there, no kids, there's maybe a dog, right? A couple goldfish, but it's like, I think it's disingenuous to say that like grinding isn't worth it, but you have to make sure that the reward at the end of that road for that grind is something you actually want. Like so many people are so focused on just doing, because I imagine, you know, the people that watch your stuff, and certainly my audience, like they're so ready and willing to give up their 20s, you know, to accomplish this goal and just to grind. But it's like, make sure you're grinding towards something you actually want to do. Because I wish somebody would have told me that, like, especially with the internet and with social media, like there's so many different ways to make money and to have a scaled media platform that you can really, you know, create whatever life you want to. Like you need to make sure that like you're building in a direction that you actually want to build, because there aren't just two paths, you know, and I would add like product management, like software development in there on the tech side of like two
course.
super sexy jobs that, you know, people think like those are your only three options, right?
Yeah.
Tech, consulting, finance. But like there's a lot of stuff out there, especially in New York. I mean, there are 6-figure dog walkers here, you know, like you can do so many things and have an amazing life. So you just have to make sure you're working for rewards that you actually want at the end of the day.
Well, the perfect quote I think for that is something that I heard. It's actually Pomp's wife, Marina Pompliano. It was a book release, and she said, "What's the point of winning the rat race? Because at the end, you're still a rat." And it's like important to kind of remember that, because it's like, yeah, even if I win this, like what is the award? What am I really winning? And so it's an important thing to kind of reflect on at the end of the day.
That's a good quote. Yeah.
So we talked a lot about, of course, your early years in consulting. Let's go back then. If you could give yourself advice to young Colin, you're walking across the stage at UGA, ready to take on the world. What do you wish you knew then that you know now?
Don't blow your signing bonus on a backpacking trip to Europe.
Really? Okay.
Because you won't be able to afford an apartment.
Okay.
Which, honestly, if somebody would have said that, I wouldn't have taken that advice.
Sure.
Because I don't regret taking that trip at all.
Yeah.
More serious piece of advice would probably be to whatever. Just don't lose sight of, I guess, the other aspects of what makes like a life. Like I think when I was very early on in my career, I was hammering and I was like grinding and just putting as much into the work bucket as I thought I had to.
Yeah.
And I probably neglected some relationships and some people in my life that I wish I wouldn't have. Now again, I was 22 and 23 then. Now I'm only 28, right?
Yeah.
So I think luckily through a really good partner and just like some experiences in my life that really forced me to take that break.
Yeah.
I think I've done my part to repair and now like, you know, really reinvigorate those relationships. But I know people who were in, you know, different positions who didn't make that choice, right? And so I think that like, yes, you can grind, but like it takes, this is going to sound wrong, but like it takes so little to shoot that Instagram DM or that LinkedIn message or that text or to really call someone when I was waiting in the lounge at the airport, or when I was in the Uber on the way to the client side, or, you know, when I was working late and it was just me in the office, right? Like you can reach out in those moments, and that's really like that compound networking piece, because the few people I did decide not to invest my time and effort into, but like to maintain that relationship with, I mean, they've just gone on to do incredible things, and I'm really blessed to be able to count on certain people in my life as like really good friends and brothers, honestly, and sisters, because I made those investments. So I'm lucky that I didn't, you know, I wasn't told that in the first year of my career, but around like the end of the second year, like I really like, okay, like I can't lose sight of this, because at the end of the day, like I don't want to get a really fancy home and have, you know, nothing in it but work clothes. You know what I mean? Like I want to make sure I'm building a life at the end of the day. Which is a really good segue actually into your section about goal setting.
Go for it.
Want to talk to? Okay. So I will say, you know, oftentimes, you know, people sort of ask me like what, especially now, right? People ask me what like my 2, 5, and 10 year goals look like. And I would say that my perspective on that recently has really changed to the extent where I wouldn't say I have a whole lot of goals. I mean, certainly, especially now as an entrepreneur, I've got very tough or hard goals in terms of like obviously the income I need to survive and feed my family. But I look at goals now as much more like what life do I want to live versus like just like numbers and like certain like statistics and metrics, because I feel like you get into the comparison game a lot. Whereas like Tim Ferriss, who I'm sure you're familiar with, in one of his podcasts or one of his newsletter editions, he talks about this exercise called like dream setting, where you literally take a piece of paper and you write out like, if you wake up, like what does your perfect day look like, what does your perfect life look like, and what are the activities you're doing, right? Are you flying, you know, coach or private, like how many cars do you have, how are you dressing, what events are you going to, what are you doing for work, you know, and all these things. And so I did that, and then the next step is literally to put a dollar amount next to all those things. And so you literally tally up and say, how much would it cost to live this dream life? And I think if people actually did that exercise, you realize that like me and my wife did it together as a family, and like our number fell below $1 million, which is mind blowing to me, right? Like my wildest dreams, like I felt like a loser, you know, I was like, damn, I need more money. But it's like going through one of those exercises, you realize like, okay, like this is really attainable for me, right? Especially, you know, life is long and I've got some great opportunities in my life. And so like, I think that like building your life in a way where you're chasing certain activities or certain methods of living your life, not just I need to make X amount of money, because what you realize is there's so many different and weird ways to make that money. You know, like my mother lives back in Athens, you know, where I went to college, and the person that owns her apartment complex that she rents in makes most of his money because he has an e-commerce business where he basically sells custom habitats for like rare or exotic animals.
Okay.
That's that's the business he started, right? That allows him to own a very nice, multi-unit, multi-family, place in a thriving college town, right?
Yeah.
Does very well for himself. He drives an Aston Martin, and it's like, there's some junior banker in Manhattan pulling his hair out, right now, because he knows he's gonna have to be up till 2 a.m. figuring out some model, right? But there are just so many different ways where you really owe it to yourself to figure out, what do I want my life to look like, and then how do I put those pieces in place instead of just working to this almighty God number you have in your head, because there are a lot of ways to get there, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that I've done that exercise myself too, of thinking, what do I want my life to look like? Because it's easy to lose track of that.
That's right.
Honestly, and so I try to incorporate as many of those things in my dream life into my life right now.
That's right.
It's like, what do I dream of? I dream of reading and learning a lot and talking to interesting people, and so that's something you've also kind of mentioned in your videos, like becoming the person that you want to be, like acting like you are that multimillionaire with a nice car, with the greatest job in the world, like just acting like that person now. There's no reason for you not to act like that, and so I think there's a lot that can kind of go into that. It's like nothing's stopping you from living the life that you want or being that type of person.
I mean, if we can lean on the border of woo woo for a second, I mean, I think there is something to like manifestation and visualization and vibration of like putting yourself in the mindset. I mean, there's a concept of the brain, something it does called the reticular activating system, right? Like if you really want a Jeep, all you're going to see on the road is Jeeps, right? You tell your brain to focus on something, that's what it focuses on. That's a proven, studied, research concept, right? And so why would that not apply to these elements of your dream life? If you're really, really looking for an opportunity to, build a business or find this partner or build this skill or, whatever your goals happen to be, like writing that down, reminding yourself of that, looking for opportunities to step into that now, I think is really, really important. I've definitely wasted many hours of real estate brokers' times, like looking at apartments in the city that I would never afford.
Sure,
I can't rent this. But you're on street easy. It's $20,000 a month. Sure, let's do it. I need to vibrate it this way. So I think that stuff is really, really important. And I love what you said about the habits and aspects of your dream life that you're turning on now. Because I think people forget to do that. They think they're going to wake up one day and they're going to be 45 years old and have all their problems solved. And it's like you can start to, in small ways, start to turn on these things now to one, see if you really like them, right? A lot of people, again, like know what you're grinding for, but it's like I think it builds up an incredible sense of momentum too, to feel that, if you're not 100% of the way, but if you can do something today that gets you 10% of the way there, I think that really like fires you up and creates, I know in my life, like a lot of juice and motivation to continue to chase that stuff.
Well, talking again about goals, of course, setting goals is important. SMART goals is a thing everybody has learned about. But something that I'm kind of facing now, and that I'd love your perspective on, is, when you set that 2-year goal, the 5-year goal, does that kind of get in the way of those opportunities that come up in your life that maybe you never would have planned for? Like for you, I mean, I'm sure in 2020, before you'd ever created content, you never would have envisioned where you are now.
Never.
And so it's like almost sometimes if you're too rigid with your goal, you turn down the other opportunities that could 10x much more than what your goal ever was. And so I'm just curious, like what your perspective is, like when an opportunity does come to you, how do you kind of weigh, is this part of what I want for the long term? Is this something different, but I just never considered it? Like, how do you think about that?
I mean, I think it's a really good question. I think it again goes back to the principle of like know what you want that idealized life to look like, because then it makes it really easy to look backwards and say like, is this a step on that path or not? But I think it's also understanding, like I think Naval Ravikant is founder evangelist, big tweeter. He has this quote of like I guess X, or I don't know what you call it now, but what does he say? Like you should have something about like, you should know what you want, but basically be fuzzy in the way in which you get there. Because the fact of the matter is, I mean, the world is changing. And so even if you want something that today someone else has and you can see how they got it, how you're going to get that thing is going to look completely different, right? Based on your circumstances and also the times we live in. So I think it's good to have those goals, but just understand that your road may look a little different. And you should make yourself open to opportunities, right? That's why I love podcasts. I love showing up to Yap, right? Because you never know who's going to watch this, listen to it, and take something away from it that enables them to engage with you in some way, right? And so I think that like, there's another guy that's on Twitter all the time is Sahil Bloom.
Of course.
Great guy. Had the chance to meet him a couple times, and he's as brilliant in person as he is online. But he always talks about this, your surface area of luck, right? And it's like, so one thing in general, once you have a goal, is you have to do everything you can to increase the surface area that something good will happen, right? You're making a really, really big net, and then hopefully one day you run into someone who had a last minute speaker cancellation at Columbia, right?
Yeah.
Or, you run into someone who could possibly, help you produce a podcast right for the summer. And so it's like
Yeah.
doing those things, like I think the biggest thing is like making sure you really, really know the life you're trying to build, because then that in essence becomes the rubric or the filter through which you, evaluate opportunities. Because you're someone who, with your scaled media platform, the podcast, the YouTube, all this stuff, I mean, I'm sure you get a lot of people reaching out to you. You've got a lot of things you could potentially be doing. I'm suffering from this now as well. Is like you have to know what you're building, because there are a lot of opportunities to waste your time.
Definitely.
And to take you off the path of what you ultimately want to be building for yourself. So it's important to have some sort of filter or rubric or life you want to live that you can judge some of these opportunities by.
Yeah, well, I'm really glad you mentioned surface area of luck. We mentioned Brett earlier. He was my first podcast guest. We spent a good amount of time talking about surface area of luck, and now just reflecting on that, of course, this is a little bit of a different direction, but being in New York, being in environments where good things can happen to you, going to those networking events, working in person instead of virtual, that a lot of people were given the opportunity to do. I think I've always really tried to focus on expanding that surface area of luck. Posting content online is an amazing opportunity. And it's just funny because, of course, I was talking to Brett about this, and the Creator Economy NYC, his organization, was in a different spot then than it is now. And just looking at his trajectory, he was just at the White House a few weeks ago. Talking about expanding your surface area of luck. I mean, he got to the White House and was in front of Biden, which is pretty surreal. And so I think it's really being in New York, being in the right environments, even if you're not in New York, there's still things that you can do to put yourself in the position for good things to happen to you. And I'm just really glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, I think one of the other biggest misses I see the younger generation making, when I say this, I'm talking about people who are 5 years younger than me, but like they
almost
they vastly underestimate the power of like an in-person physical interaction, right?
Yeah.
Obviously we're two New York guys, like we're gonna hype up the city all day, but like to whoever's watching this, it could be Miami to them, it could be Los Angeles, it could be Chicago, Kansas City, it could be any number of metropolitan areas, but yeah, like getting into a place where one, you just see it, like there's a lot of stuff that like until you see it, you really don't know that it's possible or that it's an option. And I think New York is excellent for that, because again, there are a million different things that people are doing in the city, and you get exposed to a lot of different ways of accomplishing something that maybe you didn't think was possible before. And then it just allows you to get your reps in at a pace where it's literally up to you to determine how fast or how slow you want to move. Like New York is always 1,000 miles a minute. And you were talking about this with networking earlier. I've seen this with like business opportunities, like pitching and selling now for myself in terms of certain brands I want to work with. Like you can just throw 1,000 shots a day here, and get told no 998 times. Of those 2 yeses could be what you need to just completely alter the trajectory of your life. So big, now we're just going to start bragging about New York a little bit. But yes, I was talking about this actually in a recent video, because like it's crazy how many people don't understand that, and they want to do something that just allows them to change their life as little as possible. But it's like there's a reason it's so difficult really to come and establish yourself in a place like this, because once you're in and once you have a really solid foundation, like what it allows you to do is it's mind-blowing. It's almost tough to describe, but like you really get exposure to people that just aren't even on the internet, in a way like that makes them accessible. So yeah, the physical location of where your feet are planted is incredibly important, especially early on.
Yeah. Off camera, we were just talking about me using the phone, and I think that's one of those things, like people create so many reasons for why they can't start something. It's like, I want to start a YouTube channel. I need to buy a $2,000 DSLR camera.
That's right.
Or, I want to start playing basketball or get in the gym, but I need new workout clothes. Like there's so many things that if you can just take that action, be the person you want to be, and it's just amazing how things kind of come to fruition. But one thing that it seemed like a good transition. You said if you the one thing you regret, maybe not regret, but would have done differently, is spend your money on the trip to Europe after graduation.
Yes.
I didn't do that. I didn't go on the quintessential post-grad Europe trip. I wouldn't say I regret that I don't, but it's a good transition because one of your favorite books is Die with Zero.
Yes.
And that's something that I think Bill Perkins would definitely advocate for, is going, spending the money, have that experience, because we talked about compound interest, compound networking. He talks about the compounding value of memories and how that trip you took after college, like you don't just get the value of experiencing it in a moment, but experience it right now when you think back on it. If you go with friends, you guys can talk about that for the rest of your lives, and there is a lot of value, and the argument could be made that $1,000 you spent on that is worth way more than what that $1,000 compounds to 30 years from now, because realistically, the way that it made me comfortable with moving to New York is like spending an extra $50 here, $500 here, like, yes, that adds up to a lot, but
Right.
you know, what's $50 to you when you're 50 and you
right.
should hopefully have way more money than that.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious kind of how that book helped you, like what aspects of your life it kind of transformed, or, you know,
Totally.
what it kind of opened your eyes to.
Yeah, no, I love that book, and I'm happy to do that. I will say, you know, this is a good reminder to always, you know, take with a grain of salt any personal finance advice you get from a billionaire, right?
Sure. Yeah,
I think,
that
you
is
know,
fair.
He's definitely put himself in a situation where, you know, $50,000, they're like, yeah, you know. Excellent book, though, because I think the biggest thing, especially, again, me coming from a very blue-collar, non-corporate professional environment, you're just, so much pressure is put on just, like, saving money, having this ginormous pile of money that eventually goes to, I guess, some kid someday, right?
Yeah.
And I think the biggest thing that really altered my perspective on all of that is there's some crazy stat in the book where he says the average age of a, like, I guess, of a recipient of a death benefit, right? And so the average age someone hands over money from a parent to a child is something like, it's someone in like their late 60s or early 70s.
Yeah.
And he talks about the fact that, like, money, of course, compound interest, like, money will gain money generally, hopefully, over time. But he talks about how, imagine if that money, instead of when you're 70 years old, you get that at 25 or 26 or 27. Obviously, it'll be much less. But imagine if that ends up being the down payment on a home, or the safety net someone can get while they're pursuing advanced education, or the startup cost of, you know, going into a new business venture, right? It's like that. Even if it's less money, giving that to a potential heir earlier in their life allows them to utilize it in a way that could set them up for much bigger returns. Whereas when you're 70 years old, ideally, you're through your mortgage. You've got your car paid off. You know, you may be able to, I don't know, get a boat or go on a nice vacation.
Hopefully by 70, finances aren't necessarily that much of a concern.
That's right.
Yeah.
It'll probably just then become a pass-through cost that you just give to your grandkids, right?
Exactly.
Like at that point.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, great for the grandkids. But, you know, I think it's it changed my perspective certainly on, like, inheritance and all that stuff, especially now as a father who's really thinking about that and thinking about, you know, 529s and life insurance, and I have a will now, and like all these things that get really real once you have this, you know, human that you are legally obligated to take care of. I think it also brings to mind a lot of good things about experiences as well, like you say, of you can't really put a price on like a certain experience you've had in your life. And actually, you reminded me of something where on that backpacking trip, I was in Amsterdam past midnight, enjoying everything Amsterdam has to offer, is all I'll say about that. And I met someone in a bar who was with his colleagues. This is 2018. Have a great night. Years pass. This guy sends me a LinkedIn message 2 weeks ago about the fact that he's now, he was an executive at a professional services firm. Him and some of his buddies started essentially a consortium or a holding company of a couple different professional services firms, specifically in IT. And they're starting a podcast, and they've got a couple different like apprenticeship and like young professional programs that they'd want my help on to either like promote or like to either like build some programming around, which is, you know, potentially a huge opportunity. And literally, like, I genuinely like didn't even, like, we haven't had words in 6 years, you know, and this is something where 6 years have passed, and the combination of my impression on him in that bar, which I guess was incredible 6 years ago, I must have been an incredible 22-year-old to talk to. And just combined with, I guess he's been able to follow my journey on social media because I've been making content since I was 24, gave him enough confidence to reach out to me and really know where I was in my life, right? Because that's another great thing about content is like you can, when you've been doing this for years, you know, I'm sure you go back and you see those old videos, right? It's like you can see your whole life, right? And so like you talk about compound networking, and like not only do you get to take away from that experience in a die with zero perspective of like you may not be able to do this again for a very long time, but also you just don't know where all these loose threads will sort of connect one day in a way that's like will truly blow your mind. So yeah.
No, I love that perspective. And honestly, I hadn't thought much about the inheritance thing since I read the book, because like I got other takeaways, but I remember, of course, telling my dad he needed to read the book right after. But yeah, it's so interesting because, again, like you said, getting the money at 70 years old, like, that's not going to really change your life, but it can totally change your life if you're 30 years old trying to buy a house, you know, provide for your children. So an interesting perspective there. And then talking about just, again, the compounding effects. It's like, I think we're both still so early on in our careers, is like you still have no idea how things will turn out. And I think that's the beauty of creating content is, it's one thing to connect with someone. Like let's say you're at the bar, you connected with them, fine, that's great. Like you have one more LinkedIn connection. But if you're not like posting content, like staying front of mind, because like I know so many people who are like, yeah, like I'm networking, and then they connect and that's it. Like you would never remember them. Ever. For us, posting on LinkedIn and posting on social media, like it just keeps you more front of mind, so that when he creates that consortium and he's looking to have someone to help him out build this program, like of course you're going to come to mind. You're on his LinkedIn, he sees you. Whereas like it's so important to not just have the connection, but then to actually keep it maintained, where maybe you're not checking in with them every few months like you said at the beginning, but that they at least can interact with you and see that you're still, doing something. Because I think so many people just get complacent and they're like, all right, like I connected, that's the end of it. Whereas like it's important to stay kind of top of mind and fresh.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest things that I didn't even realize I was doing when I was creating content, is like I'm essentially like carbon dating myself. You know, you can see all these different phases of my career, all these different jobs I've had. You can see me having a girlfriend that was a fiance, that was a wife, and that's all the same person, thank God. It's like you can see all these different aspects of my life, different apartments or different backgrounds in my videos. It's like you see all these different slices, but in any given video, you can also, it's kind of like a T. You can see out and sort of see like, okay, like what am I talking about? Like what are the different aspects of my life? It's like it really allows for these like really cool like slices over time. But then someone who's literally, it's the perfect situation for someone who's literally reaching out to someone they hadn't talked to in 6 years. Because in an afternoon he could blitz through selected highlights of all this history I've done and just get a really good understanding of what I've been up to. And we got on the call and that's exactly what happened. Like he was telling me stuff, we're like, oh yeah, I did make a video about that, so it's been really, really cool. And it's something I think is again another big miss to where, I'm not, I haven't had the most successful career in the world. I consider myself like I'm a guide. I'm not a guru, right? Sure. But it's like, if anyone, I think, working a professional job or even a non-professional job, like if you can find a way to put things out into the universe as just like nodes of just like, this is where I'm at, this is what I'm learning, this is what I'm excited about, this is what I'm potentially struggling with, like you just have no idea who that could potentially touch, especially in today's, social or interest graph, based society we're living in. That stuff will, the pieces of content you're putting out there will find its, likewise people, and you'll start to build that digital community, which has been, obviously, completely transformative in my life, in yours too, I'd imagine.
Well, Colin, I really appreciate you coming on. This has been one of my favorite podcasts, and I think there's so many similarities between our thought process. It's like all the buzzwords that I have in my head with compound interest, with surface area of luck. It's like my girlfriend, she'll be listening to this and be like, wow, you're the same person. So really love all of that. For everyone else who hasn't followed you already, where can they find you? Where can they support what you're doing? I know you're on a lot of platforms, so this is your opportunity to plug the links, plug everything you're working on, and I'll let you handle it.
I appreciate that. Look, if you want to find me, I'm pretty much everywhere as at career Colin as one word. I'm on LinkedIn specifically. You can just look me up as Colin Rocker. And I'll say I've got no specific sort of products or services to plug, but I guess I will say that just like as a parting note, and hopefully gift to your audience, like whatever it is you want to do in your life, whatever life you want to potentially build, that time will pass anyways. And so you might as well do something, however small it is. Again, we talked about compounding a lot on this podcast. Like however small that action is, if you can build that up consistently over time, you will wake up one day and 6 months, a year, 10 years are going to go by. But it's like who you are in that 10 years can be radically different. And I say that because I recently, because it's been 10 years since I graduated high school, which is crazy, I had the opportunity to go to my high school reunion. And it was crazy to see, just how lives can happen, right? And everyone was pretty much the same like person. Like nothing was like really like surprising to me, but it's like, wow, like you can spend that 10 years becoming, however far down the path of your life you want to, if you choose to do so, I guess is what I'll say. And so like, the time will pass anyways. And so I guess whatever you want to do, like make that first step, make that small step in a way that's consistent, and then just watch like just the, the magic really happen for you.
Yeah. Well, Colin Rocker, appreciate it.
Yeah, man, this was fun.
Yeah.